Section number 37 of Canada, the Empire of the North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Canada, the Empire of the North, by Agnes C. Laut. From 1812 to 1820, Part 4. The invaders were resting on their arms, snatching a breakfast of biscuit and cheese, about midday, when General Sheaffe arrived from Fort George with troops breathless from running. A heart-shattering huzza from the village warned the Americans that help had come, and they were to arms in a second, but Sheaffe had swept round the heights, Indians on one side of the hill, soldiers on the other, and came on the surprised Americans as from the rear. There was a wild whoop, a dash up the hill, pause to fire, when the air was splinted by 900 instantaneous shots. Then through the smoke the British rushed the heights at bayonet point. For 3 hours the contest raged in full sight of Lewiston, a hand-to-hand butchery between Sheaffe's fresh fighters and the Americans, who had been on their feet since midnight. Indian tomahawk played its part, but it is a question if the scalping knife did as deadly work as the grenadiers' long bayonets. Cooped up between the enemy and the precipice, the American sharpshooters waited for the help that never came. In vain Van Rensselaer's officers prayed and swore and pleaded with the volunteer troops on the Lewiston side. The men flatly refused to cross, for boatloads of mangled bodies were brought back at each passage. Discipline fell to pieces. It was the old story of volunteers, brave enough at a spurt, going to pieces in panic under hard and continued strain. Driven from Queenston Heights, the invaders fought their way down the cliff path by inches to the waterside, and there were no boats. Pulling off his white necktie, an officer held it up on the point of his sword as signal of surrender. It was one of the most gallant fights on both sides in Canadian history, though officers over on the Lewiston shore were crying like boys at the sight of 900 Americans surrendering. Truce was then arranged for the burial of the dead. The bodies of Brock and MacDonell were laid on a gun wagon and conveyed between lines of sorrowing soldiers, with arms reversed, to the burial place outside Fort George. As the regimental music rang out the last march of the two dead officers, minute guns were fired in sympathy all along the American shore. "He would have done so much for us," said the American officers of the gallant Brock. Van Rensselaer at once resigns. Proclamation! Smyth, whose addresses resemble 4th of July backwoods orations, succeeds as commander of the American army, but Proclamation Smyth makes such a mess of a raid on Fort Erie, retreating with a haste suggestive of Hull at Detroit, that he is mobbed when he returns to the United States shore. But what the United States lose by land they retrieve by sea. England's best ships are engaged in the great European war. From June to December, United States vessels sweep the sea, but this is more a story of the English navy than of Canada. The year of 1812 closes with the cruisers of Lake Ontario chasing each other through many a wild snowstorm. As the year 1812 proved one of jubilant victory for Canada, so 1813 was to be one of black despair. With the exception of 4 brilliant victories wrested in the very teeth of defeat, The year passes down to history as one of the darkest in the annals of the country. The population of the United States at this time was something over 7,000,000, and it was not to be thought for one moment that a nation of this strength would remain beaten off the field by the little province of Ontario (Upper Canada), whose population numbered barely 90,000. General Harrison hurries north from the Wabash with from 6,000 to 8,000 men to retrieve the defeat of Detroit. At Presqu' Isle, on Lake Erie, hammer and mallet and forging iron are heard all winter preparing the fleet for Commodore Perry that is to command Lake Erie and the upper lakes for the Americans. At Sackett's Harbor similar preparations are under way on a fleet for Chauncey to sweep the English from Lake Ontario, and all along both sides of the St. Lawrence, as winter hedged the waters with ice, lurk scouts, the Americans, for most part, uniformed in blue, the Canadians in Lincoln green with gold braid, watching chance for raid and counter raid during the winter nights. The story of these thrilling raids will probably pass into the shadowy realm of legend handed down from father to son, for few of them have been embodied in the official reports. For being hard pressed on the defensive, Canada has suddenly sprung into the position of jubilant victor, and if Brock had lived, she would probably have followed up her victories by aggressive invasion of the enemy's territory. But all effort was literally paralyzed by the timidity and vacillation of the Governor General, Sir George Prevost's. Prevost's one idea seems to have been that as soon as the obnoxious embargo laws were revoked by England the war would stop. When the embargo was revoked and the armistice of midsummer simply terminated in a resumption of war, this idea seems to have been succeeded by the single aim to hold off conclusions with the United States till England could beat Napoleon and come to the rescue. All winter long scouts and bold spirits among the volunteers craved the chance to raid the anchored fleets of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, but Prevost not only forbade the invasion of the enemy's territory, but before the year was out actually advocated the abandonment of Ontario. If his advice had been followed, it is no idle supposition to infer that the fate of Ontario would have been the same as the destiny of the Ohio and Michigan. One night in February the sentry at the village of Brockville, named after the dead hero, was surprised by 200 American raiders dashing up from the frozen river bed. Before bugles could sound to arms, jails had been opened, stores looted, houses plundered, and the raiders were off and well away with 52 prisoners and a dozen sleighloads of provisions. Gathering some 500 men together from the Queenston region, MacDonell and Jenkins of the Glengarrys prepared to be revenged. Cannon were hauled out on the river from the little village of Prescott to cross the ice to Ogdensburg. The river here is almost 2 miles wide, and as it was the 23rd of February, the ice had become rotten from the sun glare of the coming spring. As the cannon were drawn to mid-river, though it was 7 in the morning, the ice began to heave and crack with dire warning. To hesitate was death, to go back as dangerous as to go forward. With a whoop the men broke from quick march to a run, unsheathing musket and fixing bayonet blades as they dashed ahead to be met with a withering crossfire as they came within range of the American batteries. In places the suck of the water told where the ice had given behind. Then bullets were peppering the river bed in a rain of fire. Jenkins and MacDonald to the fore, waving their swords. Then bombs began to ricochet over the ice. If the range of the Ogdensburg cannon had been longer, the whole Canadian force might have been sunk in mid-river. But the men were already dashing up the American shore, whooping like fiends incarnate. First a grape shot caught Jenkins' left arm, and it hung in bloody splinters. Then a second shot took off his right arm. Still he dashed forward, cheering his men, till he dropped in his tracks, faint from loss of blood. No answer came back to the summons to surrender, and taking possession of an outer battery, the Canadians turned its cannon full on the village. Under cover of the battery fire, and their own cannon now in position, the whole force of Canadians immediately rushed the town at bayonet point. Now the bayonet in a solid phalanx of 500 men is not a pleasant weapon to stand up against. As the drill sergeant's order, you not only stick the bayonet into your enemy, but you turn it round to let the air in, so he will die. And before the furious onslaught of bayonets, the defenders of Ogdensburg broke and fled for the woods. Within an hour the Canadians had burnt the barracks, set fire to 2 schooners iced up, and come off with loot of a dozen cannon, stores of all sorts, and with prisoners to the number of 74. The ice had left Lake Ontario early this year, and by mid-April Commander Chauncey slipped out of Sackett's Harbor with 16 vessels, having on board 1,700 troops, besides the crews. It will be remembered that the capital of Ontario had been moved from Niagara, Newark, to York, Toronto, on the north side of Lake Ontario, then a thriving village of 1,000 souls on the inner shore of Humber Bay. On the sand reef known as the Island, in front of the harbor, had been constructed a battery with cannon. The main village lay east of the present City Hall. Westward less than a mile was Government House, on the site of the President residence. Between Government House and the village was not a house of any sort, only a wood road flanking the lake, and badly cut up by ravines. Just west of Government House, and close to the water, was a blockhouse or tower used as powder magazine, mounted with cannon to command the landing from the lake. Some accounts speak of yet another little outer battery or earthwork farther westward. North of the Government House road, or what is now King Street, were dense woods. General Sheaffe, who had succeeded Brock at Queenston Heights, chanced to be in Toronto in April with some 600 men. Just where the snug quarters of the Toronto Hunt Club now stand, you may look out through the green foliage of the woods fringing the high cliffs of Lake Ontario, and there lies before your view the pure sky-blue surface of an inland sea washing in waves like a tide to the watery edge of the far skyline. Early in the morning of April 27th, a forest ranger, dressed in the customary Lincoln green, was patrolling the forested edge of the Scarborough Heights above the lake. The trees had not yet leafed out, but were in that venerable state when the branches between earth and sky take on the appearance of an aerial network, just budding to light and color, and in the ravines still lay patches of the winter snow. The morning was hazy warm, odoriferous of coming summer, with not a breath of wind stirring the water. As the sun came up over the lake, long lines of fire shot through the water haze. Suddenly the scout paused on his parade. Something was advancing shoreward through the mist, advancing in a circling line like the ranks of wild birds flying north, with a lap, lap, lap of water drip and a rap, rap, rap of rowlocks from a multitude of sweeps. The next instant the forest rang to a musket shot, for the scout had discovered Commodore Chauncey's fleet of 16 vessels being towed forward by rowers through a dead calm. The musket shot was heard by another scout nearer the fort. The signal was repeated by another shot, and another for the whole 12 miles, till General Sheaffe, sitting smoking a cigar in Government House, sprang to his feet and rushed out, followed by his officers, to scan the harbor of Humber Bay from the top of the fort bastions. Sure enough, there was the fleet, led by Chauncey's frigate, with 24 cannon poking from its sides, a string of rowboats in tow behind to land the army, coming straight across the harbor, over water calm as silk. It has been told how the fleet made the mistake of passing beyond the landing, but the chances are the mistake was intentional for the purpose of avoiding the cannon of the fort bastions. At all events the report may be believed that the most of Toronto's people forgot to go back to breakfast that morning. A moment later officers were on top of the bastion towers, directing batterymen to take range for their cannons. A battalion variously given, as from 50 to 100, along with some Indians, was at once dispatched westward to ambush the Americans landing. Another division was posted at the battery beyond Government House. Sheaffe saw plainly from the number of men on deck that he was outnumbered 4 to 1, and the flag on the Commodore's boat probably told him that General Dearborn, the commander-in-chief, was himself on board to direct the land forces. Sheaffe had been bitterly blamed for two things: for not invading Niagara after the victory on Queenston Heights, and for his conduct at Toronto. He now withdrew the main forces to a ravine east of the fort, plainly preparatory for retreat. Not thus would Brock have acted. Meanwhile, time had worn on to 9 o'clock. The American ships have anchored. The Canadian cannon are sending the bombs skipping across the water. The rowboats are transferring the army from the schooners, and the ambushed sharpshooters are picking the bluecoats off as they step from ships to boats. "By the powers!" yells Forsyth, an American officer, "I can't stand seeing this any longer. Come on, boys, jump into our boats!" And he bids the bugles blow till the echoes are dancing over Humber waters. Dearborn and Chauncey stay on board. Pike leads the landing, and Chauncey's cannon set such grape and canister flying through the woods as clear out those ambushed shooters, the Indians flying like scared partridges, and the advance is made along Government House Road at quick march. Just west of the Government House battery the marchers halt to send forward demand for surrender. Firing on both sides ceases. The smoke clears from the churned-up waters of the bay, and Commander Pike has seated himself on an old cannon, when, before answer can come back to the demand, a frightful accident occurs that upsets all plans. Waiting for the signal to begin firing again, a batteryman in the near bastion was holding the lighted fuse in his right hand, ready for the cannon, when something distracted his attention, and he wheeled with the lighted match behind him. It touched a box of explosives. If any proof were needed that the tragedy was not designed, it is to be found in the fact that English officers were still on the roof of the blockhouse, and the apartment below crowded with Canadians. A roar shook the earth. A cloud of black flame shot into mid-air, and the next minute the ground for half a mile about was strewn with the remains, mangled to a pulp, of more than 300 men, 90 of whom were Canadians, 260 Americans, including Brigadier Pike, fatally wounded by a rock striking his head. In the horror of the next few moments, defense was forgotten. Wheelbarrows, trucks, gun wagons were hurried forward to carry wounded and dead to the hospital. Leaving his officers to arrange the terms of surrender, at 2 p.m. Sheaffe retreated a quick march for Queenston, pausing only to set fire to a half-built ship and some naval stores. Lying on a stretcher on Chauncey's ship, Pike is roused from unconsciousness by loud huzzas. "What is it?" he asks. "They are running up the Stars and Stripes, sir." A smile passed over Pike's face. When the surgeon looked again, the commander was dead. For 24 hours the haggle went on as to terms of capitulation. Within that time, 2 or 3 things occurred to inflame the invading troops. They learned that Sheaffe had slipped away, as the American general's report put it. They got the shell, but the kernel of the nut got away. They learned that stores had been destroyed after the surrender had been granted. Without more restraint, and in defiance of orders, the American troops gave themselves up to plunder all that night. In their rummaging through the Parliament buildings, they found hanging above the Speaker's chair what Canadian records declare was a wig, what American reports say was a human scalp, sent in by some ranger from the West. From what I have read in the private papers of fur traders in that period regarding international scalping, I am inclined to think that wig may have been an American scalp. Certainly the fur traders of Michilimackinac wrapped no excuses round their savagery when the canoes all over the coasts of Lake Superior, in lieu of flags, had American scalps flaunting from their prows. At all events, word went out that an American scalp had been found above the Speaker's chair. It was night. The troops were drunk with success and perhaps with the plunder of the wine shops. All that night and all the next day and night the skies were alight with the flames of Toronto's public buildings on fire. Also the army chest with $10,000 in gold, which Sheaffe had forgotten, was dug up on pain of the whole town being fired unless money were delivered. Private houses were untouched. Looted provisions, which the fleet cannot carry away, Chauncey orders distributed among the poor. Then, leaving some 400 prisoners on parole not to serve again during the war, Chauncey sails away for Niagara. End of section 37. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section number 38 of Canada, the Empire of the North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Canada, the Empire of the North, by Agnes C. Laut. From 1812 to 1820, Part 5. It is a month later. Down at Fort George on the Canadian side, General Vincent knows well what has happened at Toronto and is on the lookout for the enemy's fleet. On the American side of the Niagara River, from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, are 7,000 troops eager to wipe out the stain of last year's defeat. On the Canadian side, from Fort George to Chippewa and Erie, are 2,300 men, mostly volunteers from surrounding farms, and powder is scarce and provisions are scarce, for Chauncey's fleet has cut off help from St. Lawrence and Kingston way. All the last 2 weeks of May, heavy, hot fog lay on the lake and on the river between the hostile lines. But there was no mistaking what Chauncey's fleet was about. Red-hot shot showers on Fort George in a perfect rain. Standing on the other side of the river are thousands of spectators, among them one grand old swashbuckler fellow in a cocked hat, whose fighting days are past, taking snuff after the fashion of a former generation, and wearing an air of grand patronage to the American troops because he has seen service in Europe. "No, sir," says the grand old fighting cock pompously to his auditors, "can't be done. Have seen it tried on the continent, and you can't do it. Lay a wager you can't do it. Can't possibly set fire to a fort by red-hot shot." Then, at night time, when the lurid glare of flame lights up the foggy darkness, the old gentleman is put to his trumps. "See," they say, "Fort George is on fire." And over at Fort George the bucket brigade works hard as the cannoneers. But the fog is too good a chance to be missed by Chauncey. Rowing out with muffled oars all the nights of May 24th and 25th, he has his men sounding in silence the channel, right within pistol shot of Fort George. The night of the 26th, troops and marines are bidden breakfast at 2 in the morning, and be ready for action with a single blanket and rations for 1 day. That is all they are told. They embark at 4. The waters are dead calm. The morning of the 27th, gray as wool with fog, sweeps out Chauncey's fleet, circles up to Fort George with 100 scows in tow, carrying 50 soldiers each. Vincent takes his courage in his teeth and gathers his 1,000 men inside the walls. Then the cannon of the frigates split fog and air and earth, and under cover of the fire the scows gain the land by 9 a.m. First, Vincent's sharpshooters sally from the fort and fire. Then they fire from the walls. Then they overturn guns, retreat from the walls, throw what powder they cannot carry into the water, and retreat, fighting, behind stone walls and ditches. The contest of 1,000 against 6,000 is hopeless. Vincent sends couriers riding like the wind to Chippewa and Queenston and Erie, ordering the Canadians to retire to the back country. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Americans are in possession of the Canadian side from Fort George to Erie. Vincent retreats at quick march along the lake shore towards what is now Hamilton. June 1st, General Dearborn sends his officers, Chandler and Winder, in hot pursuit with 3,500 men. Vincent's soldiers have less than 90 rounds of powder to a man. He has only 1,000 men, for the garrisons of Chippewa and Queenston Heights and Erie have fallen back in a circle to the region of St. David's. June 5th, Vincent's Canadians are in camp at Burlington Bay. Only 7 miles away, at Stony Creek, lies the American army, out sentries posted at a church, artillery on a height commanding a field, officers and men asleep in the long grass. Humanly speaking, nothing could prevent a decisive battle the next day. The 2 American officers, Chandler and Winder, sit late into the night, candles alight over camp stools, mapping out what they think should be the campaign. It is a hot night, muggy with June showers, lighted up by an occasional flash of sheet lightning. Then all candles out, and pitch darkness, and silence as of a desert. The American army is asleep, in the dead sleep of men exhausted from long, hard, swift marching. The artillerymen on the hillocks, the sentries, the outposts at the church, they too are sound asleep. But the Canadians, too, know that, humanly speaking, nothing can prevent a decisive battle on the morrow. The stories run. I do not vouch for their truth, though facts seem to point to some such explanation, that Harvey, a Canadian officer, had come back to the American army that night disguised as a Quaker peddling potatoes, and noted the unguarded condition of the exhausted troops. Also that Fitzgibbons, the famous scout, came through the American lines dressed as a rustic selling butter. Whether these stories are true or not, or whether indeed the Canadians knew anything about the American camp, they plucked resolution from desperation. If they waited for the morrow's battle, they would be beaten. Harvey proposed to Vincent that 700 picked men go back through the dark and raid the American camp. Vincent left the entire matter to Harvey. Setting out at 11:30 along what is now Main Street, Hamilton, the Canadians marched in perfect silence. Harvey had given orders that not a shot should be fired, not a word spoken, the bayonet alone to be used. By 2 in the morning of June 6 the marchers came to the church where the sentries were posted. 2 were stabbed to death before they awakened. The third was compelled to give the password, then bayoneted in turn. The Canadian raiders might have come to the very midst of the American army if it had not been for the jubilant hilarity of some young officers, who, capturing a cannon, uttered a wild huzza. On the instant, bugles sounded alarm, drums beat a crazy tattoo, and every man leaped from his place in the grass, hand on pistol. The next second the blackness of the night was ablaze with musketry. The soldiers were firing blindly. Officers were shouting orders that nobody heard. Troops were dashing here, there, everywhere, lost in the darkness. The heavy artillery horses breaking tether ropes and stampeding over the field. Major Penderleith, with a company of young Canadians, suddenly found himself in the midst of the American camp. One of the young raiders stabbed 7 Americans to death. A brother bayoneted 4, and before daylight betrayed the smallness of the forces, the raiders came safely off with 3 guns and 100 prisoners, including the 2 American officers, Winder and Chandler. The loss to the British was 115 killed and wounded, but there would be no battle the next day. The Battle of Stony Creek sent the Americans retreating back down the lakefront to Fort George, harried by the English fleet under Sir James Yeo from Queenston. 100 episodes might be related of the Stony Creek raid. For years it was to be the theme of campfire yarns. For instance, in the flare of musketry fire, a Canadian found himself gazing straight along the blade of an American's bayonet. "Sir, the password," demanded the American sentry. Luckily the scout, instead of wearing an English red coat, had on a blue jacket resembling that of the American Marines, and he instantly took his cue. "Rascal!" he thundered back. "What do you mean? Off your line? Go back to your post!" The sentry's bayonet dropped. There was momentary darkness, and the Canadian literally bolted. Then ludicrous ill luck befell all the generals. Vincent had accompanied the raiders on horseback. When the bugle sounded "retire," he gave his horse the bit, and in the pitch darkness the brute carried him pell-mell along the wrong road, over fences and hayfields, some 15 miles into the back country. Next day, when Vincent was missing, under flag of truce messengers went to the retreating American army to find if he were among the dead. At 4 in the afternoon his horse came limping into the Canadian camp. Chandler, the American officer, on awakening had sprung on horseback and spurred over the field shouting commands. In the darkness his horse fell and threw him. When Chandler came to himself, he was prisoner among the Canadians. Winder's ill luck was equally bad. By the flare of the firing he saw what he thought was a group of artillerymen deserting a gun. Dashing up, he laid about him with his pistol, shouting, "Come on! Come on!" Another flare of fire, and he found himself surrounded by a circle of Canadian bayonets. "Drop your pistol, sir, or you are a dead man," ordered a young Canadian, and Winder surrendered. It will be recalled that the garrisons of Queenston below the falls, and Chippewa above, and Erie at the head of the river, had retreated from the invading Americans to the back country, now traversed by Welland Canal. From different posts beyond what was known as the Black Swamp, these bands of the dispersed Canadian army swooped down on the American outposts, harrying the whole American line from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. Of all the raiders none was more daring than Lieutenant Fitzgibbons, posted beyond the beaver dams, at a stone house near Deque's Falls. Space forbids more than one episode of his raids. Once, while riding along Lundy's Lane alone, he was recognized by the wife of a Canadian captain, who dashed from the cottage, warning him to retreat, as 150 Americans had just passed that way. Standing in front of the roadside inn was the cavalry horse of an American. Fitzgibbons couldn't resist the temptation for a bout with the foe, and dismounting, was entering the door when a soldier in blue dashed at him with leveled musket. Naturally not keen to create alarm, Fitzgibbons knocked the weapon from the man's hand, and without a sound had thrown him on the ground, when another American rifleman dashed from behind. Strong as a lion, Fitzgibbons threw the first man violently against the second, and was holding both at bay beneath his leveled rifle when one of the downed men snatched the Irishman's sword from the scabbard. He was in the very act of thrusting the sword point into Fitzgibbons when the innkeeper's wife, with a dexterous kick, sent the weapons whirling out of his hand. Fitzgibbons disarmed the men, tied them, threw them across his horse, and himself mounting, galloped to the woods with a laugh, though 150 Americans were within a quarter a mile. The American commanders at Niagara determined to clean out this nest of raiders from the back country, and Lieutenant Boerstler was ordered to march from Fort George with some 600 men. Leaving Fort George secretly at night, Boerstler came to Queenston at 11 on the night of June 23rd. Here all Canadian soldiers free on parole were seized, to prevent word of the attack reaching the back country. The troops were not even permitted to light camp fire or candles. The great secrecy of the American marchers at once roused suspicion among the Canadians between Queenston and the village of St. David's that the expedition was directed against Fitzgibbon's scouts. At his home, between Queenston and St. David's, dwelt a United Empire Loyalist, James Secord, recovering from dangerous wounds received in the Battle of Queenston Heights. He was too weak himself to go by night and forewarn Fitzgibbons, but his wife, Laura Ingersoll, a woman of some 30 years, was also of the old United Empire Loyalist stock. She immediately set out alone for the back country to warn Fitzgibbons. Many and contradictory stories are told of her march. Whether she tramped 2 nights and 2 days, or only 1 night and 1 day, whether her march led her 20 or only 12 miles, matters little. She succeeded in passing the first sentry on the excuse she was going out to milk a cow, and she eluded a second by telling him she wished to visit a wounded brother, which was true. Then she struck away from the beaten path through what was known as the Black Swamp. It had rained heavily. The cedar woods were soggy with moisture, the swamp swollen, and the streams running a mill race. Through the summer heat, through the windfall, over the quaking forest bog, tramped Laura Secord. It may be supposed that the most of wild animals had been frightened from the woods by the heavy cannonading for almost a year. But the hoot of screech owl, the eldritch scream of wildcat, the far howl of the wolf pack hanging on the trail of the armies for carrion, were not sounds quieting to the nerves of a frightened woman flitting through the forest by moonlight. It was clear moonlight when she came within range of Beaver Dam and Decoud's house. She had just emerged in an open field when she was assailed with unearthly yells, and 1,000 ambushed Indians rose from the grass. "Woman, a woman! What does a white woman here?" demanded the chief, seizing her arm. She answered that she was a friend and it was matter of life and death for her to see Fitzgibbons at once. So Laura Secord delivered her warning and saved the Canadian army. The episode has gone down to history, one of the national legends, like the story of Madeleine Verchères on the St. Lawrence. Fitzgibbons posts his 40 men in place, and Ducharme, commander of the Indians, scatters his 1,000 redskins in ambush along the trail. Also, word is sent for 2 other detachments to come with all speed. June 24th, at 7 in the morning, Boerstler is moving along a narrow forest trail through the beech woods of Beaver Dams. The men are advancing single file, mounted infantrymen first with muskets slouched across saddle pommels, then the heavy wagons, then cavalry to rear. The timber is heavy, the trail winding. Here the long line deploys out from the trail to avoid jumping windfall. There halt is made to cut a way for the wagons. Then the long line moves sleepily forward, yellow sunlight shafted through the green foliage across the riders' blue uniforms. Suddenly a shot rings out, and another, and another. The forest is full of unseen foes, before, behind, on all sides, the cavalry forces breaking rank and dashing forward among the wagons. Boerstler sees it will be as unsafe to retreat as to go on. Sending messages back to Fort George for aid, he pushes forward in an open wheat field. 56 men have fallen, and the bullets are still raining from an invisible foe. Looking back, he sees mounted men in green coats passing and repassing across his trail, filing and refiling. It is a trick of Fitzgibbon's to give an impression he has 10 times 40 men. But the Americans do not know. There is no retreat, and Indians are to the fore. In the midst of confusion, Fitzgibbons comes forward with a white handkerchief on his sword point and begs Boerstler to prevent bloodshed by instant surrender. Boerstler demands to see the number of his enemies. Fitzgibbons says he will repeat the request to his commanding officer. Luck is with Fitzgibbons, for just as he goes back a small party of reinforcements arrives, and one of its captains acts the part of commanding officer, telling Boerstler's messenger hotly that the demand to see the enemy is an insult. An answer must be given in 5 minutes, or the Canadians will not be responsible for the Indians. The fight has lasted 3 hours. Boerstler surrenders with his entire force. Such was the Battle of Beaver Dams. End of section 38. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section number 39 of Canada, the Empire of the North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Canada, the Empire of the North, by Agnes C. Laut. From 1812 to 1820, Part 6. Ever since Brock had captured Detroit in 1812, General Procter, with 2,500 Canadians, had been holding the western part of Ontario, and the defeat of the English at Fort George had placed him in a desperate position. His men had been without pay for months. Their clothes were in tatters, and now, with the Americans in possession of Niagara region, there was danger of Procter's food supply being cut off. Procter himself had not been idle these 6 months. In fact, he had been too active for the good of his supplies. Space forbids a detailed account of the raids directed by him and carried out with the aid of Tecumseh, the great Shawnee chief. January of 1813 saw a detachment of Procter's men up Raisin River, west of Detroit, where they defeated General Winchester and captured nearly 500 prisoners, to be set free on parole. Harrison, the American general, is on his way to Lake Erie to rescue Detroit. Procter hastens in May to meet him with 1,000 Canadians and 1,500 Indians. The clash takes place at a barricade known as Fort Meigs on Maumee River, south of Lake Erie, when again, by the aid of Tecumseh, Procter captures 450 prisoners. It was on this occasion that the Indians broke from control and tomahawked 40 defenseless American prisoners. August sees Procter raiding Sandusky, but the Americans refuse to come out and battle, and the axes of the Canadians are too dull to cut down the ironwood pickets. And when at night Procter's bugles sound retreat, he has lost nearly 100 men. At last, in September, the fleets being built for the Canadians at Amherstburg and for the Americans at Presqu' Isle are completed. Whichever side commands Lake Erie will control supplies, and though Captain Barclay, the Canadian, is short of men, Procter cannot afford to delay the contest for supremacy any longer. He orders Barclay to sail out and seek Commodore Perry, the American, for decisive battle. On Barclay's boats are only such old land guns as had been captured from Detroit. His crews consist of lake sailors and a few soldiers, all in some 384 men on 6 vessels. September 10th, at midday at Put-in Bay, Barclay finds Perry's fleet of 7 vessels with 650 men. For 2 hours the furious cannonading could be heard all the way to Amherstburg. Space forbids details of the fight so celebrated in the annals of the American Navy. After broadsides that tore hulls clean of masts and decks, setting sails in flame and the waters seething in mountainous waves, the two fleets got within pistol shot of each other, and Perry's superior numbers won. 1/3 of Barclay's officers were killed and 1/3 of his men. The Canadian fleet on Lake Erie was literally exterminated before 3 in the afternoon. Procter's position was now doubly desperate. He was cut off from supplies. At a council with the Indians, through Tecumseh, the chief was for fighting to the bitter death. It was decided to retreat up the Thames to Vincent's army near modern Hamilton. All the world knows the bitter end of that retreat. Procter seems to have been so sure that General Harrison would not follow, that the Canadian forces did not even pause to destroy bridges behind them, and behind came Harrison, hot foot, with 4,000 fighters from the Kentucky backwoods. October 1st, the Canadians had retreated as far as Chatham, provisions and baggage coming in boats or sent ahead on wagons. Procter's first intimation of the foe's nearness was a breathless messenger with word the Americans just a few miles behind had captured the provision boats. Sending on his family and the women with a convoy of 250 soldiers, Procter faced about on the morning of October 5th to give battle. On the left was the River Thames, on the right a cedar swamp, to rear on the east the Indian mission Moraviantown. The troops formed in line across a forest road. Procter seems to have lost both his heart and his head, for he permitted his fatigued troops to go into the fight without breakfast. Not a barricade, not a hurdle, not a log was placed to break the advance of Harrison's cavalry. The American riders came on like a whirlwind. Crack went the line of Procter's men in a musketry volley. The horses plunged, checked up, reared, and were spurred forward. Another volley from the Canadians. But it was too late. Harrison's 1,500 riders had galloped clean through the Canadian lines, slashing swords as they dashed past. Now they wheeled and came on the Canadians' rear. Indians and Canadians scattered to the woods before such fury, like harried rabbits. Poor Tecumseh in the very act of tomahawking an American colonel when a pistol shot brought him down. The brave Indian chief was scalped by the white backwoodsmen and skinned and the body thrown into the woods a prey to wolves. Flushed with victory and without Harrison's permission, the Kentucky men dashed in and set fire to Moraviantown, the Indian mission. As for Procter, he had mounted the fleetest horse to be found and was riding in mad flight for Burlington Heights. It is almost a pity he had not fallen in some of his former heroic raids, for he now became a sorry figure in history, reprimanded and suspended from the ranks of the army. The only explanation of Procter's conduct at Moraviantown is that he was anxious for the safety of his wife and daughters. perhaps needlessly fearing that the rough backwoodsmen would retaliate on them for the treachery of the Indians tomahawking American prisoners of war. And it had fared almost as badly with the Canadian fleet on Lake Ontario. The boats under Sir James Yeo, the young English commander, were good only for close-range fighting. The boats under Commander Chauncey best for long-range firing. All July and August the fleets maneuvered to catch each other off guard. Between times each raided the coast of the other for provisions, Chauncey paying a second visit to Toronto, Yeo swooping down on Sodus Bay. All September the game of hide-and-seek went on between the two Ontario squadrons. Sunday night, the 8th of September, in a gale, 2 of Chauncey's ships sank, with all hands but 16. 2 nights later, in a squally wind, by the light of the moon, 2 more of his slow sailors, unable to keep up with the rest of the fleet, were snapped up by the English off Niagara with 100 captives. Again, on September 27th, at 8 in the evening, 6 miles off Toronto harbor, Chauncey came up with the English, and 2 fleets poured broadsides into each other. Then Yeo's crippled brigs limped into Toronto harbor, while Chauncey sailed gaily off to block all connection with Montreal and to help to convey troops from Niagara down the St. Lawrence for the master stroke of the year. The way was now clear for the twofold aim of the American staff, to starve out Ontario and concentrate all strength in a signal attack on Montreal. The autumn campaign was without doubt marked by the most comical and heroic episodes of the war. Wilkinson was to go down the St. Lawrence from Lake Ontario with 8,000 men to join General Hampton coming by the way of Lake Champlain, with another 5,000 men in united attack against Montreal. November 5th, Wilkinson's troops descended in 300 flat boats through the Thousand Islands, now bleak and leafless and somber in the gray autumn light. It seemed hardly possible that the few Canadian troops cooped up in Queenston would dare to pursue such a strong American force. But history is made up of impossibles. Feeling perfectly secure, Wilkinson's troops scattered on the river. By November 10th, at 9 in the morning, half the Americans had run down the rapids of the Long Sault, and were in the region of Cornwall, pressing forward to unite with Hampton, where Chateauguay River came into Lake St. Louis, just above Montreal. The other half of Wilkinson's army was above the Long Sault, near Chrysler's farm. From the outset the rear guard of the advancing invaders had been harried by Canadian sharpshooters. November 11th, about midday, it was learned that a Canadian battalion of 800 was pressing eagerly on the rear. Chance shots had been a rattling fusillade. Quick as flash the Americans land and wheel face about to fight, posted behind a stone wall and along a dried gully with sheltering cliffs at Chrysler's farm. By 2:30 the foes are shooting at almost hand-to-hand range. Then, through the powder smoke, the Canadians break from a march to a run and charge with all the dauntless fury of men fighting for hearth and home. Before the line of flashing bayonets the invaders break and run. 200 have fallen on each side in action of less than 2 hours. Then the boats go down to the other half of the army at Cornwall, and here is worse news. News that sends Wilkinson's army back to the American side of the St. Lawrence, without attempting attack on Montreal. General Hampton, on his way from Lake Champlain, has been totally discomfited. Finding the way to the St. Lawrence barred by the old raiders' trail of Richelieu River, Hampton had struck across westward from Lake Champlain to join Wilkinson on the St. Lawrence, west of Montreal, somewhere near the road of Chateauguay River. With 5,000 infantry and 180 cavalry, he has advanced to a ford beyond the fork of Chateauguay. Uncertain where the blow would be struck, Canada's governor had necessarily scattered his meagre forces. To oppose advance by the Chateauguay, he has sent a young Canadian officer, de Salaberry, with 150 French Canadian sharpshooters and 100 Indians. De Salaberry does not court defeat by neglecting precautions because he is weak. Windfall is hurriedly thrown up as barricade along the trail. Where the path narrows between the river and the bleak forest, de Salaberry has tree trunks laid spike end toward the foe. At the last moment comes Macdonell of Brockville with 600 men, but de Salaberry's 300 occupy the front line facing the ford. Macdonell is farther along the river. By the night of October 25th, the American army is close on the dauntless little band hidden in the forest. On the morning of the 26th, 3,000 Americans crossed the south bank of the river, with the design of crossing north again farther down and swinging round on de Salaberry's rear. At the first shot of the bluecoats poor de Salaberry's forlorn little band broke in panic fright and fled. But de Salaberry on the river bank had grabbed his bugle boy by the scruff of the neck with a grip of iron, and in terms more forcible than polite bade him sound, sound, sound the advance, till the forest was filled with flying echoes of bugle calls. Macdonell behind hears the challenge, and mistaking the cheering call for note of victory, bids his buglers blow, blow, advance, blow and cheer like devils. The Americans pour shot into the forest. The bugle calls multiply till the woods seem filled with an advancing army, and the yells split the sky. Also Macdonell has ordered his men to fire kneeling, so that few of the American shots take effect. The advancing host became demoralized. At 2:30 they sounded retreat, and it may truly be said that the Battle of Chateauguay was won by de Salaberry's bugle boy, held to the sticking point, not because he was brave, but because he could not run away. It is said that Hampton simply would not believe the truth when told of the numbers by whom he had defeated. It is also said that immediately after the victory de Salaberry fell ill from a bad attack of nerves, brought on by lack of sleep. However that may be, the Canadian governor, Prevost, did not suffer from an attack of conscience, for in his report to the English government he ascribed the victory to his own management and presence on the field. The year of 1813 closes darkly for both sides. Before withdrawing from Niagara region, the invaders ravaged the country and set fire to the village of Newark, driving 400 women and children roofless to December snows. Sir Gordon Drummond, who has just come to command in Ontario, retaliates swiftly and without mercy. He crosses the Niagara by night. The fort is carried at bayonet point, 300 men captured and 3,000 arms taken. Next Lewiston is burned, then Black Rock, and on the last day of the year, Buffalo. Down on the Atlantic coast, both fleets win victories, but the English work the greater hurt, for they blockade the entire coast south of New York. On the English squadron are European mercenaries, who have been given the name of Canadian battalions, because their work is to harry the American coast in order to draw off the American army from Canada. European mercenaries have been the same the world over, riff-raff blackguards guilty of infamous outrages the moment they are out from under the officer's eye. These were the troops, misnamed Canadians, whose infamous conduct left a heritage of hate long after the war. But this is a story of the Navy rather than of Canada. The contest has now lasted for almost 2 years, and both sides are as far from decisive victory as when war was declared in June of 1812. Long since the embargo laws of France and England against neutral nations have been rescinded, and the American coast has suffered more from the blockade of this war than it ever did from the wars between France and England. The year 1814 opens with Napoleon defeated and England pouring aid across the Atlantic into Canada. Wilkinson's big army hovers inactive round Lake Champlain, and Prevost is afraid to weaken Montreal by forwarding aid to Drummond at Niagara. The British fleet blockades Sackett's Harbor, and the American fleet blockades Kingston. The Canadians raid Oswego on Lake Ontario for provisions. The Americans raid Port Dover on Lake Erie, leaving the country a blackened waste and Tom Talbot's Castle Malahide of logs a smoking ruin, with the determined aim of cutting off all supplies in Ontario. Drummond sends his troops scouring the country inland from Niagara for provisions. Military law is established for the seizure of cattle and grain, but for the latter as high a price is paid as $2.50 a bushel, and many a pioneer farmer back from York, Toronto, and Burlington, Hamilton, dates the foundation of his fortune from the famine prices paid for bread during the War of 1812. Of course the United States did not purpose leaving the frontier of Niagara because Drummond had burnt the forts. By May, Major General Brown had taken command of the United States troops at Buffalo. The next 2 months pass, drilling and training, and bringing forward provisions. July 3rd, at day dawn, during fog thick as wool on the lake, 5,000 American troops crossed to the Canadian side. Fort Erie's English garrison capitulates on the spot, and the English retreat down Niagara River towards Chippewa by the falls. At Chippewa, at Queenston, at Fort George, in all to guard the Canadian frontier, are only some 2,800 men. 3/4 of these are kept doing garrison duty, leaving only 700 men free afield. Just beside Chippewa, a creek some 20 feet wide comes into Niagara River. The Canadians have destroyed the bridge as they retreat, but the Americans pursue, and at midnight of the 4th the two armies are facing each other across the brook. Ominous, dreadful silence through the darkness, but for the sentries' arms or the lumbering advance of artillery wagons dragged cautiously near the Canadians. The bridge is repaired under peppering shot from the British. By 4 on the afternoon of the 5th, the Americans have crossed the stream. Their artillery is in place, and another battalion has forded higher up and swept round to take the Canadians on the flank. The Canadians must either flee in such blind panic as Procter displayed at Moraviantown, or turn and fight. Indians in ambush, reinforcements from Fort George and Queenston formed in 3 solid columns. The English wheel to face the foe. First there is the rattling clatter of musketry fire from shooters behind in the grass. Then the solid columns break from a march to a run and charge with their bayonets. The artillery fire of the Americans meets the runners in a terrible death blast. But as the front lines drop, the men behind step in their places till the armies are not 100 yards apart. Then another blast from the heavy guns of the Americans literally tears the Canadian columns to tatters. As the smoke lifts, there are no columns left, only scattered groups of men retreating across a field strewn thick with the mangled dead. Out of 1,200 men, the Canadians have lost 500. The charge of the forlorn 1,200 at Chippewa against the artillery of 4,000 Americans has been likened to the charge of the Light Brigade in the Russian War. Though the Canadians were defeated, their heroic defense had for a few days at least checked the advance of the invaders. And now the position of the beleaguered became desperate. At Fort George, at Queenston, and at Burlington Heights, the men were put on half rations. End of section 39. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section number 40 of Canada, the Empire of the North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Canada, the Empire of the North, by Agnes C. Laut. From 1812 to 1820, Part 7. Why did the Americans not advance at once against Queenston and Fort George? For 3 weeks they awaited Chauncey's fleet to attack from the water side, so the army could rush the fort from the land side. But Chauncey was ill and could not come, and the interval gave the hard-pressed Canadians their chance. Drummond comes from Kingston with 400 fresh men. He calls on the people to leave their farms and rally as volunteers to the last desperate fight. This increased his troops by another 1,000, though many of the volunteers were mere boys, who scarcely knew how to hold a gun. Then, from a dozen signs, Drummond's practiced eye foresaw that a forward movement was being planned by the enemy without Chauncey's cooperation. All the American baggage was being ordered to rear. False attacks to draw off observation are made on Fort George outposts. American scouts are seen reconnoitering the back country. Drummond rightly guessed that the attack was being planned in one of two directions, by rounding through the back country, either to fall in great numbers on Fort George, or to cut between the Canadian army of Hamilton region and of Niagara region, taking both battalions in the rear. From Fort George to Queenstown, Canadian troops are posted by Drummond, and where the road called Lundy's Lane runs from the falls at right angles to the back country, more battalions are ordered on guard against the advance of the invaders. Fitzgibbons, the famous scout, climbing to a tree on top of a high hill, sees the Americans, 5,000 of them, gray coats, blue coats, white trousers, moving up from Chippewa towards Lundy's Lane. Quickly 1,600 Canadian troops under General Riel take possession of a hill fronting Lundy's Lane and the falls. On the hill is a little brown church and an old-fashioned graveyard. In the midst of the graves the Canadian cannon are posted. Round the cemetery runs a stone wall screened by shrubbery, and on both sides of Lundy's Lane are endless orchards of cherry and peach and apples, the fruit just beginning to redden in the summer sun. Whether the enemy aim at Fort George or Hamilton, the Canadian position on Lundy's Lane must be passed and captured. As soon as Drummond had Fitzgibbon's report, he sent messengers galloping for Hercules Scott, who had been ordered to retreat to the lake, to come back to Lundy's Lane with his 1,200 men. It may be imagined that the Americans guessed what message the horseman, in the slather of foam, was bearing back to Hercules Scott, for they at once attacked the Canadians in Lundy's Lane with fury, to capture the guns on the hill before Hercules Scott's reinforcements could come. It was now 6 o'clock in the evening on July 25th, a sweltering hot night, and the troops on both sides were parched for water, though the roar of whole inland oceans of water could be heard pouring over the falls of Niagara. As the Canadians had charged against the American guns at Chippewa, so now the Americans charged uphill against the guns of the Canadians, hurling their full strength against the enemy's center. Creeping under shelter of the cemetery stone walls, the bluecoats would fire a volley of musketry, jump over the fence, dash through the smoke, bayonet in hand, to capture the Canadian guns. Time again, the rush was dauntlessly made, and time again met by the withering blast. Before 9 o'clock the attacking lines had lost more than 500 men, and as many Canadians had fallen on the hill. The dead and mangled lay literally in heaps. As darkness deepened, lit only by the wan light of a fitful moon and the awesome flare of volley after volley, the fearful screams of the dying could be heard above the roar of the falls and the whistle of cannonball. Riel, the commander of the Canadians, had been wounded and captured. Of his 1,600 Canadians, Drummond had now left only 1,000, and he was himself bleeding from a deep wound in the neck. Half the American officers had been carried from the field injured, and still the command was repeated to rush the hill before Scott's reinforcements came, and each time the advancing line was driven back, shattered and thinned, Canadians dashing in pursuit, cheering and whooping till both armies were so inextricably mixed it was impossible to hear or heed commands. It was in one of these melees that Riel, the Canadian, found himself among the American lines and was captured to the wild and jubilant shouting of the boys in blue and gray. Pause fell at 9 o'clock. The Americans were mustering for the final terrible rush. The moon had gone behind a cloud, and the darkness was inky. Then a shout from the Canadian side split the very welkin. Hercules Scott had arrived with his 1,200 men on a run, breathless and tired from a march and countermarch of 20 miles. The Americans took up the yell, for fresh reserves had joined them, too, and Lundy's Lane became a bedlam of ear-shattering sounds. Heavy artillery wagons forcing up the hill at a gallop over dead and dying, bombs from the Canadian guns exploding in the darkness, horses taking fright and bolting from their riders, carrying American guns clear across the lines among the Canadians. A wild yell of triumph told that the Americans had captured the hill. For the next 2 hours it was a hand-to-hand fight in pitchy darkness. Drummond, the Englishman, could be heard right in the midst of the American lines, shouting, "Stick to them, men! Stick to them! Don't give up! Don't turn! Stick to them! You'll have it!" And American officers were found amidst Canadian battalions, shouting stentorian command, "Level low! Fire at their flashes! Watch the flash!" and "Fire at their flashes!" The Americans have captured the Canadian guns, but in the darkness they cannot carry them off. Each side thinks the other beaten, and neither will retreat. In the confusion it is impossible to rally the battalion, and men are attacking their own side by mistake. Both sides claim victory, and each is afraid to await what daylight may reveal, for it is no exaggeration to say that at the battle of Lundy's Lane the blood of 1/3 of each side dyed the field. The Canadians as defenders of their own homes, fighting in the last ditch, dare not retire. The Americans, having more risk in numbers, withdraw their troops at 2 in the morning. Of her 2,800 men, Canada had lost 900, and the American loss is as great. Too exhausted to retire, Drummond's men flung themselves on the ground and slept lying among the dead, heedless alike of the drenching rain that follows artillery fire, of the roaring cataract, of the groans from the wounded. Men awakened in the gray dawn to find themselves unrecognizable from blood and powder smoke, to find, in some cases, that the comrade whose coat they had shared as pillow lay cold in death by morning. While Drummond's men bury the dead in heaps and carry the wounded to Toronto, the invaders have retreated with their wounded to Fort Erie. It now became the dauntless Drummond's aim to expel the enemy from Fort Erie. 5 days after the battle of Lundy's Lane, he had moved his camp halfway between Chippewa and Fort Erie. But in addition to its garrison of 2,000, Fort Erie is guarded by 3 armed schooners lying at anchor on the lake front. Captain Dobbs of Drummond's forces makes the first move. At the head of 75 men, he deploys far to the rear of the fort through the woods, carrying 5 flatboats over the forest trail 8 miles, and on the night of the 12th of August slips out through the water mist towards the American schooners. "Who goes?" challenges the ship's watchman. "Provision boats from Buffalo," calls back the Canadian oarsman, and the rowboats pass round within the shadow of the schooner. A moment later the American ships are boarded. A trampling on deck calls the sailors aloft, but Dobbs has mastered 2 vessels before the fort wakes to life with a rush to the rescue. Delay means almost inevitable loss to Drummond, for Prevost will send no more reinforcements, and the Americans are daily strengthening Fort Erie. Bastions of stone have been built. Outer batteries command approach to the walls, and along the narrow margin between the fort and the lake earthworks have been thrown up, mounted with cannon elbowing to the water's edge. Taking advantage of the elation over Dobbs' raid of the schooners, Drummond plans a night assault on the 15th of August. Rain had been falling in splashes all day. The fort trenches were swimming like rivers, and it may be mentioned that Drummond's camp was swimming too, boding ill for his men's health. One of the foreign regiments was to lead the assault round by the lake side, while Drummond and his nephew rushed the bastions. It will be remembered these foreign regiments of Napoleonic wars were composed of the offscourings of Europe. The fighters were to depend on bayonet alone, giving no quarter. Splashing along the rain-soaked road in silence and darkness, scaling ladders over shoulders, bayonets in hand, the foreign troops came to the earthwork elbowing out into the lake. This was passed by the men wading out in the lake to their chins, but the noise was overheard by the fort sentry, and a perfect blaze of musketry shattered the darkness and drove the mercenaries back pell-mell, bellowing with terror. A few of the English and Canadian troops pressed forward, only to find that they could not reach within ladder distance of the walls at all, for spiked trees had been placed above the trenches, in a perfect criss-cross hurdle of sharpened ends. In old letters of the period one reads how the trenches were literally heaped with a jumbled mass of the dead. The other attacking columns fared almost as badly. One of the bastions had been entered by the cannon embrasures. Drummond, Jr., shouting to "Give no quarter! Give no quarter!" when from the cross-firing in the courtyards the powder magazine below this bastion was set on fire, and exploded with a terrific crash, killing the assailants almost to a man. In all, killed, wounded, missing, the assault cost Drummond's army 900 men. September proved a rainy month. Drummond's camp became almost a marsh, and the health of the troops compelled a move to higher ground. It was then the Americans sallied out in assault. Neither side could claim victory, but the skirmish cost each army more than 500 men. Sir James Yeo now comes sailing up Lake Ontario with some of the 16,000 troops sent from England. The weather had become unfavorable to movement on either side. Rain and sleet continuously. Drummond foresaw that the season would compel the abandonment of Fort Erie, and on November 5 a scout came in with word that the invaders had crossed to the American side and Fort Erie had been blown up. While Drummond is fighting for the very life of Canada along the Niagara frontier, the war continues in desultory fashion elsewhere. Kentucky riflemen raid western Ontario from Detroit to Port Dover. Up on the lakes is a story of the war that reads like a page from Border Raiders. American fur traders destroy Sault Ste. Marie. Canadian fur traders retaliate by swooping on Mississippi fur posts. Out on the Pacific coast, an English gunboat has captured John Jacob Astor's fur post on the Columbia, and now in the fall of 1814 the Northwest Fur Company of Montreal are conveying from Astor's fort the furs, worth millions of dollars, in canoes across the upper lakes to Ottawa River. Two armed American schooners hiding on the north shore of Lake Huron lie in wait for the gay raiders of the Northwest Company. But at the Sault the Northwest voyageurs get wind of the danger. They in turn hide their canoes in some of the blue coves of the north shore. Then, stealing out at night, in canoes with muffled paddles, the Nor'westers come on one schooner while the watch is asleep. They board her, bayonet the crew, pinion some of the wounded to the decks, and with the captured vessel sidle up to the other vessel, and, before she is aware of the new masters on board, have captured her too. Then, scalps flaunting at the prows of their canoes, the Nor'west fur traders gaily go their way. Down at Lake Champlain occurs the great fiasco of the war, the blot on Canada's escutcheon. Prevost, with 10,000 reinforcements, has been ordered by the English governor to proceed from Montreal against the Americans by both water and land. While an English fleet attacks the Americans, Prevost is to lead the troops against Plattsburg. But the Canadian fleet meets terrible disaster. The commander is killed by a rebounding cannonball just as the action begins, and 12 of the gunboats manned by the hired foreigners desert en masse. The rest of the fleet is literally destroyed. Instead of seconding attack by a battle on land, Prevost sits behind his trenches waiting for the little fleet to win the battle for him. And when the fleet is defeated, Prevost's courage sinks with the sinking ships. He gathers up his troops and retreats in a scare of haste. Such a fright of unseemly, unsoldierly haste that nearly 1,000 of his soldiers desert in sheer disgust. Down at Nova Scotia are raid and counter raid too. The British and American fleets wage fierce war that is not part of Canada's story. But in the contest, the public buildings of Washington are burned in retaliation for the burning of Newark, and down at New Orleans the English suffer a crushing defeat. Meanwhile the peace commissioners have been at work, and the war that ought never to have taken place, that settled not one jot of the dispute which caused it, was closed by the Treaty of Ghent, Christmas Eve of 1814. All captured forts, all plunder, all prisoners, are to be restored. Michilimackinac and Fort Niagara and Astoria on the Columbia go back to the United States, but of impressment and right of search and embargo of neutrals, not a word. The waste of life and happiness accomplished not a feather's weight unless it were the lesson of the criminal folly of war between nations akin in aim and speech and blood. End of section 40. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section 41 of Canada, the Empire of the North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Canada, the Empire of the North by Agnes C. Laut. From 1812 to 1846. Part 1. When Sir Alexander Mackenzie, the discoverer, went home to retire on an estate in Scotland, he found the young nobleman and philanthropist, Lord Selkirk, keenly interested in accounts of vast, new, unpeopled lands, which lay beyond the Great Lakes. A change in the system of farming, which dispossessed small farmers to turn the tenantries into sheep runs, had caused terrible poverty in Scotland at this period. Here in Scotland were people starving for want of land. There in America were lands idle for lack of people. Selkirk had already sent out some colonists to the Lake of St. Clair region of Ontario and to Prince Edward Island, but what he heard from Mackenzie turned his attention to the new empire of the prairie. Then in Montreal, where he had been dined and wined by the Northwest Company's Beaver Club, he had heard still more of this vast new land, of its wealth of furs, of its untimbered fields, where man had but to put in the plowshare to sow his crop. The one great obstruction to settlement there would be the claims of the Hudson's Bay Company to exclusive monopoly of the country. But as Selkirk listened to the descriptions of the Red River Valley given by Colin Robertson, who had been dismissed by the Nor'westers, he thought he saw a way of overcoming all difficulties which the fur traders could put in the way of settlement. Owing to competition, Hudson's Bay stock had fallen from 250 to 50 pounds sterling a share. On returning to Scotland, Lord Selkirk had begun buying up Hudson's Bay stock in the market, along with Sir Alexander Mackenzie. But when Mackenzie learned that Selkirk's object was colonization first, profit second, he broke in violent anger from the partnership in speculation, and besought William McGillivray to go on the open market and buy against Selkirk to defeat the plans for settlement. What with shares owned by his wife's family of Colville Wedderburns and those he had himself purchased, Selkirk now owned a controlling interest in the Hudson's Bay Company. Early in 1811 the company deeds to Lord Selkirk the country of Red River Valley, exceeding in area the British Isles and extending, through the ignorance of its donors, far south into American territory. Colin Robertson, the former Nor'wester who first interested Selkirk in Red River, has meanwhile been gathering together a party of colonists. Miles Macdonell, retired from the Glengarry regiment, has been appointed by Selkirk governor of the new colony. What of the Nor'westers while these projects went forward? Writes Macgillicuddy from London, where he has been stirring up enmity to Selkirk's project. Selkirk must be driven to abandon his project at any cost, for his colony would prove utterly destructive of our fur trade. How he purposed doing this will be seen. Writes Selkirk to the governor of his colony, Miles Macdonell: "The Northwest Company must be compelled to quit my lands. If they refuse, they must be treated as poachers." Selkirk believed that the Hudson's Bay Company charter to the Great Northwest was legal and valid. He believed that the vast territory granted to him was legally his own as much as his parks in Scotland. He believed that he possessed the same right to expel intruders on this territory as to drive poachers from his own Scotch parks. It was the spirit of feudalism. As for the Nor'westers, let us look at their rights. They disputed that the charter of the Hudson's Bay Company applied beyond the bounds of Hudson's Bay. Even if it did so aptly, they pointed out that by the terms of the charter it applied only to lands not possessed by any other Christian power. And who would dispute that French fur traders and Nor'westers, as their successors, had ascended the streams of the interior long before the Hudson's Bay men? It was the spirit of democracy. It needed no prophet to foresee when these two sets of claims came together there would be a violent clash. It is evening in the little harbor of Stornoway, off the Hebrides, north of Scotland, July 25, 1811. Waning midsummer has begun to shorten the long days, and lying at anchor in the twilight a few yards offshore are the three Hudson's Bay Company boats, outward bound. For a week the quiet little fishing hamlet has been in turmoil, for Governor Miles Macdonell and Colin Robertson have ordered the Selkirk settlers here, 129 of them, 70 farmers, 59 clerks, to join the Hudson's Bay boats as they swing out westward on their far cruise to the north, and the atmosphere has literally been on fire with vexations created by spies of the Northwest Company. In the first place, as the settlers wait for the ships coming up from London, troublemakers pass from group to group, scattering a miserable little sheet called the Highlander, warning the deluded people against going to a polar land of Indian hostiles. Besides, dark hints are uttered that the settlers are not wanted for colonists at all, but for armed battalions, to fight the Nor'westers for the Hudson's Bay Company, in proof whereof the prophets of evil point ominously to the cannon and munitions of war on board the three old fur boats. Then there is too much whisky afloat in Stornoway that week. Settlers are taken ashore and farewelled and farewelled and farewelled till unable to find their way down to the rowboats, and then they are easily frightened into abandoning the risky venture altogether. On the settlers who have come as clerks to the company governor Macdonell can keep a strong hand, for they have been paid their wages in advance and are seized if they attempt to desert. Then the excise officer here is a friend of the Nor'westers, and he creates endless trouble rowing round and round the boats, bawling out to know if all who are embarking are going of their own free will, till the ship's hands, looking over decks, become so exasperated they heave a cannonball over rails, which goes splash through the bottom of the harbour officer's rowboat and sends him cursing ashore to dispatch a challenge for a duel to Governor MacDonell. MacDonell sees plainly that if he is to have any colonists left, he must sail at once. Anchors up and sails out at 11 that night. The ships glide from shore so unexpectedly that one faint heart, desperately resolved on flight, has to jump overboard and swim ashore, while two other settlers, who have been lingering over farewells, must be rowed across harbor by Colin Robertson to catch the departing ships. Then Robertson is back on the wharf trumpeting a last cheer through his funneled hands. The Highlanders on decks lean over the vessel railings waving their bonnets. The Glasgow and Dublin lads, indentured as clerks, give a last huzza, and the Selkirk settlers are off for their promised land. As long ago Cartier's first colonists to the St. Lawrence had their mettle tested by tempestuous weather and pioneer hardships, so now the first colonists to the great Northwest must meet the challenge that fate throws down to all who leave the beaten path. Though the season was late, the weather was extraordinarily stormy. 61 days the passage lasted, the tubby old fur ships lying waterlogged, rolling to the angry sea. MacDonell was furious that the colonists had been risked on such unseaworthy craft. But those old fur ship captains, with 50 years ice battling to their credit, probably knew their business better than MacDonell. The fur ships had not been built for speed and comfort, but for cargoes and safety, and when storms came they simply lowered sails, turned tails to the wind, and rolled till the gale had passed, to the prolonged woe of the Highland landsmen, for the first time suffered seasick pangs. Then, when Governor MacDonell attempted drills to pass the time, he made the discovery that the setious talk had gone the rounds of the deck. The Hudson's Bay had no right to this country. The Nor'westers owned that country. The Hudson's Bay couldn't compel any man to drill and fight. Selkirk could not give clear deed to their lands, and much more to that same effect, all of which proved that some Nor'wester agent in disguise had been busy on board. September 24th, amid falling snow and biting frost, the ships anchored at 5 fathoms hole off York Factory, Port Nelson. The Selkirk settlers had been 61 days on board, and they were still a year away from their promised land. Champlain's colonists of Acadia and Quebec had come to anchorage on a land set like a jewel among silver waters and green hills, but the Selkirk settlers have as yet seen only rocks barren of verdure as a billiard ball, vales amidst the doomed hills of Hudson Straits, dank with muskeg, and silent as the very realms of death itself. But for the flacker of wild fowl, the roaring of the floundering walrus herds, or the lonely tinkling of mountain streams running from the ice fields to the mossy valleys bordering the northern sea. It needed a robust hope, or the blind faith of an almost religious zeal, to penetrate the future and see beyond these sterile shores of the promised land, where homes were to be built and plenty to abound. If pioneer struggles leave a something in the blood of the race that makes for national strength and permanency, the difference between the home finding of the West and the home finding of the East is worth noting. There were, of course, no preparations for the colonists at York Fort, for the factor could not know they were coming, or anything of Selkirk's plans, till the annual ships arrived. On the chance of finding better hunting farther from the fort, MacDonell withdrew his people from the Hayes River north across the marsh to a sheltered bank on the River Nelson. Winter had set in early. A whopping blizzard met the Pilgrims as they marched along an Indian trail through the brushwood. There is a legend of Miles MacDonell, the governor, becoming benighted between York Fort and Nelson River, and losing his way in the storm. According to the story, he beat about the brushwood for 24 hours before he regained his bearings. Rude huts of rough timber and thatched roof with logs extemporized for berths and benches were knocked up for wintering quarters on Nelson River, and the next 9 months were passed hunting deer for store of provisions and building flatboats to ascend the interior. All winter a mutinous spirit was at work among the young clerks, which MacDonell, no doubt, ascribed to the machinations of Nor'westers; but the chief factor quickly quelled mutiny by cutting off supplies, and all hands were ready to proceed when the fur brigades set out for the interior on the 21st of June, 1812. Up Hayes River, up the whole length of Winnipeg Lake, then in August the flatboats are ascending the muddy current of Red River, through what is now Manitoba, and for the first time the people see their promised land. High banks fringed with maple and oak line the river at what is now Selkirk. Then the cliffs lower, and through the woods are broken gleams of the rolling prairie intersected by ravines, stretching far as an eye can see, where sky and earth meet. From the lateness of the season, one can guess that the river was low at the boulder reach known as St. Andrew's Rapids, and that while the boats were tracked upstream, the people would disembark and walk along the Indian trails of the west bank. There was no Fort Garry near the rapids, as a few years later. Buffalo skin teepees alone broke the endless sweep of russet prairie and sky, clear swimming blue as the purest lake. Then the people are back aboard, laboring hard as the oar now, for they know they are nearing the end of their long pilgrimage. The river banks rise higher. Then they drop gradually to the flats now known as Point Douglas. Another bend in the sinuous red current, looping and curving and circling fantastically through the prairie, and the Selkirk settlers are in full view of the old Cree graveyard, bodies swathed in skins on scaffolding, down at the junction of the Assiniboine. Hard by they see the towered bastions of the Northwest Company's post, Fort Gibraltar. Somewhere between what are known today as Broadway Bridge and Point Douglas, the Selkirk settlers land on the west side. Chief Peguis and his Cree warriors ride wonderingly among the white-faced newcomers, marveling at men who have crossed the great waters to dig gardens and work land. The barracks knocked up hastily is known after Selkirk's family name as Fort Douglas, but the store of deer meat has been exhausted, and the colonists are on the verge of a second winter. They at once join the Plain Rangers, or Bois Brûlés, burnt wood runners, half-breed descendants of French and Northwest fur traders, who have been retainers of the Montreal Company. With them the Selkirk settlers proceed south to Pembina and the boundary to hunt buffalo. No instructions had yet come to Red River of the Northwest Company's hostility to the colony, and the lonely Scotch clerks of Fort Gibraltar were glad to welcome men who spoke their own Highland tongue. Volumes might be written of this, the colonists' first year in the Promised Land, how the rude Plain Rangers conveyed them to the buffalo hunt in their creaking Red River carts made entirely of wood, hub, tire, axle, and all, or else on loaned ponies. How when storm came the white settlers were welcomed to the huts and skin tents of the French half-breeds, given food and buffalo blankets. How many a young Highlander came to grief in the wild stampede of the first buffalo hunt. How when the hunters returned to Fort Gibraltar, Winnipeg, on Red River with store enough of pemmican for all the fur posts of the Nor'westers, many a wild happy winter night was passed dancing mad Indian jigs to the piping of the Highland piper and the crazy scraping of some Frenchman's fiddle. How when morning came in a gray dawn of smoking frost mist, a long line of the colonists could be seen winding along the ice of Red River home to Fort Douglas, Piper Green or Hector McLean leading the way, still prancing and blowing a proud national air. How when the spring opened 10-acre plots were assigned to each settler, close to the fort at what were known as the colony buildings, and 100-acre farms farther down the river. All this and more are part of the story of the coming of the first colonists to the great Northwest. The very autumn that the first settlers had reached Red River in 1812, more colonists had arrived on the boats at Hudson Bay. These did not reach Red River till October 1812 and in the spring of 1813. By 1813 and on till 1817 more colonists yearly came. The story of each year, with its plot and counterplot, I have told elsewhere. Spite of Nor'westers' threats, spite of the fact there would be no market for the colonists when they had succeeded in transforming wilderness prairie into farms, Selkirk's mad dream of empire seemed to be succeeding. The cardinal mistake in the contest between Hudson's Bay Company and Nor'westers, between feudalism and democracy, was now committed by the governor of the colony, Miles Macdonell. The year 1813 had proved poor for the buffalo hunters. Large numbers of colonists were coming, and provisions were likely to be scarce. Also, note it well, while the War of 1812 did not cut off supplies through Hudson Bay to the English company, it did threaten access to the west by the Great Lakes, and cut off all supplies by way of Detroit and Lake Huron for the Nor'westers. Was Macdonell scoring a point against the Nor'westers when they were at a disadvantage? Who can answer? Selkirk had ordered him to expel the Nor'westers from his lands, and if the violent contest had not begun in this way, it was bound to come in another. What Macdonell did was issue a proclamation in January of 1814, forbidding taking provisions from Selkirk's territory of Assiniboia. It practically meant that the Plain Rangers must not hunt buffalo in the limits of modern Manitoba, and must not sell supplies to the Nor'westers. It also meant that all the upper posts of the Nor'westers, the fur posts of Athabasca and British Columbia, which depended on pemmican for food, would be without adequate provisions. The Plain Rangers were enraged beyond words, and doubly enraged when some Hudson's Bay men began seizing buffalo meat at Pembina River, which was beyond the limits of Selkirk's territory. Writes Peter Fiddler, one of the Hudson's Bay factors, "If Macdonell only perseveres, he will starve the Nor'westers out." One can guess the anger in the annual meeting of the Nor'westers at Fort William in July of 1814. Like generals on field of war, they laid out their campaign. Duncan Cameron, a United Empire Loyalist officer of the 1812 war, is to don his red regimentals and proceed to Red River, where his knowledge of the Gaelic tongue may be trusted to win over Selkirk settlers. "Nothing but the complete downfall of the colony will satisfy some," wrote one of the fiery Nor'westers to a brother officer. Such was the mood of the Nor'westers when they came back from their annual meeting on Lake Superior to Red River, and MacDonell fanned this mood to dangerous fury by threatening to burn the Nor'westers' forts to the ground unless they moved from Selkirk's territory. For the present Duncan Cameron contents himself with striking up a warm friendship with the Highlanders of the settlement, and offering to transport 200 of them free of cost to Eastern Canada. MacDonell seizes still more provisions from Northwest forts. Cameron, the Nor'wester, comes back from the annual meeting of 1815 still more bellicose. He carries the warrant to arrest Governor Miles MacDowell for the seizure of those provisions. MacDowell, safe behind the palisades of Fort Douglas, laughs the warrant to scorn; but it is another matter when the Plain Rangers ride across the prairie from Fort Gibraltar armed, and pour such hot shot into Fort Douglas that the colonists, frenzied with fear, huddle to the fort for shelter. To ensure the safety of the colonists, MacDonell surrenders to the Nor'westers and is sent to Eastern Canada for a trial which never takes place. No sooner has Governor MacDowell been expelled than Cuthbert Grant, warden of the Plain Rangers, rides over to the colony and warns the colonists to flee for their lives from Indians enraged at "these land workers spoiling the hunting fields." What the Indians thought of this defense of their rights is not stated. They were silent and unacting witnesses of the unedifying spectacle of white men ready to fly at each other's throats. It was too late for the colonists to reach Hudson Bay in time for the annual ships of 1815, so the houseless people dispersed amid the forests of Lake Winnipeg, where they could be certain of at least fish for food. End of section 41. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C.